gentlemen, now we'll continue with the program. I would like to introduce the next panel. The subject is investment criteria, requirements, risks, and awards. And before I announce the moderator, I would really deeply like to thank to Mr. Richard Robinson, who is the moderator of this panel, Executive Director Serbia of the British Serbian Chamber of Commerce, because he's actually the person in charge for this cooperation. Richard and I had one fantastic meeting on October last year, and we spoke about TGA projects. After that, Richard was our speaker on the Belgrade Economic Forum in November. But then he told me actually about fantastic real estate infrastructure contacts that they have here and in London. And that is how actually we start this cooperation. So Richard, thank you deeply for those informations and made all connections with you and with Jadranka and Dr. David. And now I'll give you the floor. Richard, you can start your panel.
Thank you, Jagada. After that introduction, I can surely only disappoint, but thank you very much. But this is a very large panel, and so I'm not going to spend any of my time talking, but basically saying we have a wide range of panelists, some of which are more focused on the infrastructure side and some on the property development side. And hopefully it will be quite clear as you hear them speak what their interests are. So with no more ado, I would like to turn to Milan Elezovic, who is a managing director from Credit Suisse with many years of experience and on working with export credit agencies and with obviously great interest in the region. Thank you, Milan.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you everyone for joining this exciting event. I will be quite brief as there's so many panelists, and I will focus on two topics, both from the perspective of providers of financing or arrangers of financings for infrastructure and real estate projects. And these two topics are using export credit agencies to provide credit support for investors in the region for infrastructure projects. And the second topic is also what Louis Taylor mentioned in his speech just a few minutes ago, which is financing sustainable projects and sustainable growth. This is a very exciting and rapidly emerging topic, and it's probably more relevant than a lot of people realize, as it can be applied also to companies which are not necessarily involved in green projects, but are working on improving their key indicators that show how they are complying with various requirements in terms of environment and social and governance criteria. So in terms of using export credit agencies, this is something that is relevant for infrastructure projects where supplier of goods and services comes from abroad, from another country. That typically involves then participation of the export credit agency from that country, which provides typically 90 to 100% even of a guarantee against the risk of financing for the project. This is quite important because it substantially reduces the risk of the projects and therefore has a significant impact on the lowering the cost of financing, which is important for any sponsor of a project, and also extends the term or the maturity of the financing from typically 5 years to up to 15 years. These projects can be financed, they typically start from 50 million euros and above. They can go even to 1 billion euros and above that. And there's some exciting projects in Serbia and the region, like Belgrade Metro and other infrastructure projects that are part of this new plan. And I think that will be something that hopefully will then involve also export credit agencies around Europe and the world. In terms of sustainable growth and sustainable financing, the so-called sustainable bonds or sustainable or green bonds, which finance either projects where the proceeds are used for green projects. That's one kind of area. Another one that's quite applicable, I think, to a lot of companies and governments in the region are projects which contribute to lowering either CO2 emission or in other ways contributing to reducing various environmental negative effects. These bonds typically start with a minimum value, like a size of 200 million, which is obviously a quite high number for the region. But what's important to mention is that in addition to bonds, there are so-called private placements. These are smaller financings, which can start as little as, again, 50 million or so, which can finance these projects. So I think this is something that should be looked at, because there's a lot of demand. Just in the first 3 months of this year, there's been about 120 billion of financing provided around the world for green projects. And half of that actually was done in Europe. So there's a significant capital looking for projects. There are not many projects still that can be financed. So I think it's something to be considered by any sponsor who is embarking on a new project that needs financing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Milan. I'd like to then invite Anna Lukovic from Karanovic and Partners to discuss this topic further, with an obvious focus on some of the legal aspects related. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and thanks to organizers. It is a pleasure being here today. Well, the ideas I wanted to talk about today are what is actually now happening on the real estate market, and what is the best thing done in terms of attracting investments in Serbia, and how digitalization actually can bring more value and security to the real estate system. We all saw how COVID-19 created unprecedented market, but it also seems that real estate market is very resilient and the market is dynamic as ever. When we look at the situation in each sector, we see that many of our clients in retail and hospitality, they were hit hard. And interestingly, we also see how some are performing actually better than before. We also see huge differences between the sectors. For example, shopping centers, they suffered, but retail parks and their yields are unchanging or even higher in the region. And a lot of our clients are interested now in actually developing logistics. We see also that a lot of opportunities are expected, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there will be more M&A deals. And this is mainly because the deal stoppers are actually shifting more to valuation side, and resilience of the business became actually the key for the buy side. But if we leave COVID on the side, and if I had to pick just one thing that is implemented to attract investments in Serbia and is really working, it would be the incentives program. With the set of incentives granted to the production sector, Serbian government, along with the development agency, boosted direct investments in Serbia since 2006. And obviously, depending on the project, the amount of the investment and other factors, the incentives package can include direct cash incentives, tax refunds and exceptions, and land acquisition free of charge. And we went through this process with a lot of our clients like Continental, ZF, Aptiv, MTU, and I have to say that these are all meaningful projects for local communities as well as everyone else involved. But that's something that was implemented from 2006. So when we talk about the future, I think that we can all agree that the real estate sector is perceived as something that is not very modern, frozen, and very late in adopting new processes. Also, when we talk about the future, we must talk about digitalization, and the new technologies in the real estate sector are already actually pushing current players to rethink their offers, their property marketing. And we have PropTech startups which have created tools to reduce the pain point for the real estate sector, such as virtual apartment visits, personalization of accommodation, even digitalization of sales. So when we talk about digitalization of sales, we are actually talking about blockchains, which is one of the most talked about technologies in the recent years. And on the other side, we have actually a challenge where building a land registry system that is trustworthy and efficient seems like a never-ending project, actually. Well, that at least the blockchain technology appeared, and it is now proven to address all these challenges. There are a few countries who have pioneered actually the adoption of blockchain technology in order to improve their land registry and the transfer process. And based on their experience, the blockchain solution is believed to guarantee actually the security and transparency as well as privacy of user data. These are Georgia, Ukraine, Brazil, Honduras, United Arab Emirates. We see actually that the value of blockchain for society may be enormous, and not only in countries that lack stable institutions, but also worldwide. So to conclude, although there are many things done to improve the investments in Serbia, we should keep in mind actually that the future is actually digital. Back to you, Richard.
Thank you, Anna, for that very interesting contribution. I'd now like to hand over to Mike Roskelly. Mike has been working in recent years in one of the other big potential developments in Belgrade, but I'll let him explain rather more than I, because I can only, he is obviously completely on top of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, for inviting me to speak. I probably won't talk about that, but I can talk about, I can talk around what we've learned looking at that. And thank you also to Jagoda and Jurdanka for all their hard work in organising this conference. So before I sort of get going on my bit, just one or two words on my background. I've been working in the Central European real estate markets for the last 30 years. During this period, I worked for Jones Lang LaSalle for many years out of both their London and their Warsaw offices, and more recently have been conducting my activities through Cadenza. My main area of focus during this period has been the arranging of equity and project financing for large-scale investment and development projects with a primary focus on Poland, but also covering the whole Central European region. And it's been a fascinating period of history where I've actually managed to witness these markets undertaking an extraordinary transformation over the last 30 years. During this period, I've also been responsible for leading a number of large-scale real estate development projects in Poland. Now, Cadenza is now looking to expand its activities into Belgrade. So we're a new entrant to this market, where we're focused on acquiring residential-led brownfield urban regeneration opportunities. So trying to find interesting opportunities, where we can work around, interesting historic buildings, structures, etc., etc., and to fulfill our sustainable development objectives. So in this presentation, what I'm going to do briefly is outline some of the main reasons that attracted us to the Belgrade market. And I then want to talk through a number of the development risks that we have identified and the challenges that we've identified, as new entrants trying to come into this market. And then I'll just set out one or two thoughts that I have in terms of risk and rewards and what I think needs to happen in order to attract major foreign direct investment to support development projects in the Belgrade market. Now, why were we attracted to the Belgrade market? Well, the economic transformation that's taken place over the last 5 years has been impressive, to say the least. So, major, progress has been made in structural and institutional reforms, and that all is very supportive and conducive to real estate investment. Now, given these economic reforms, I believe that post-COVID, there should be a period of further strong economic growth. It'll take time to recover, but I very much believe that will happen. And of course, out of that sort of economic growth, there are going to be a wide range of attractive development opportunities. So what was the trigger for bringing us into the market? Well, first of all, we came and we looked at the Marina Dorchel project, which was a fascinating project. Unfortunately, we were unable to secure that. But in the process of looking at that investment and looking at the market, we've managed to identify a number of really interesting development opportunities where we believe that we can fulfill our sustainable development objectives. Clearly, our work has not been helped by COVID. When you're entering a market, face-to-face time, being on the ground, it's really important. You can only do so much through Zoom. So clearly our activities have been delayed, but that's something we've all faced and challenges we've all had to face. So looking at the market from the perspective of a new entrant, what are some of the key challenges that we've had to deal with in this market? I think one of the most frustrating aspects is the timings risks. It's the time it takes to identify really good projects and tie those down. And one of the key inhibiting factors to doing business in Serbia is basically the time it takes to close a good pipeline. And part of that arises from the fact that there's a lack of project preparation in terms of a lot of projects we're looking at. So you've really got to do a lot of background research to get to the bottom of what you're being offered. Another challenge is how to secure really good sites at sensible pricing. The easy sites that are offered to you often have pricing that's sort of well beyond what we can manage in terms of earning good investment returns for our investors if we acquired those sites at those prices. So we've had to resort to looking at off-market transactions where we come at those transactions. They're more complicated to unlock, but we're maybe having to access the deal through the acquisition of non-performing loans or some other route in order to tie down our position on the prime sites. Our approach to development is very much one, it's the Anglo-Saxon model. It's one of having a small team and outsourcing a lot of the functions that we have to perform as a developer. So we want to put a really good professional team around us. There is no doubt that within the Belgrade market, the professional service sector has transformed extraordinarily over the last few years with the current real estate boom. There's a good mix of international service providers. There's a good mix of homegrown service providers. But actually, there's not the depth of service providers that you'd normally expect in a more mature market. So in order for us to approach the market, we very much see pairing good local service providers with state-of-the-art British service providers. So it's a great area where we can have strategic cooperation between our different nations. Also, similar issues when it comes to contractors. The choice of contractors is less in this market than we would necessarily expect. Construction financing risk has been an issue for large projects. But again, we've seen major changes recently because of the success of the good large projects in Belgrade, and also because of the support we now see from groups like the EBRD and UK Export Credit Finance. Construction cost inflation risk, that's a challenge, particularly in a market with limited resources. That's something that has to be managed very carefully. One of the big challenges we face, not so much in residential, but certainly in the commercial elements of projects we're looking at, is how do we exit those projects? Because there's not a liquid real estate investment market in which to offload or to sell our projects into. And then just quickly deal with some of the other risks we see. Legal risks, they are more complicated for us to manage than they would be in mature markets. There are political risks to deal with. Serbia's made extraordinary progress on that front, but there are still perceptions issues with the investor base that we're addressing, and we need to overcome these. And on that point as well, historically Serbia's had a number of corruption issues. They again have improved remarkably over the last 10 years. but there's still a perception issue that we need to overcome with our investor base to encourage them to engage in this market. So, if I can bring my little talk just to a conclusion, we believe that given the structural reforms, the good economic prospects, within Serbia, there are some wonderful development opportunities. However, in order for us to, attract the sort of investors that we deal with, we're going to need to be able to tie these projects down and prepare them properly for investment. The Serbian market faces a number of quite major risks, so we're going to have to show to our investor base that they can earn the sorts of returns that are going to reward them for taking on those risks. Back to you.
Thank you, Mike, for saying that. I think next I'd like to invite Vojkan to Brankovic, the founder and chief executive of Apiran, a private equity fund based in London, but obviously of Serbian origin. Vojkan, thank you very much for joining us.
Very good. Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank Jagoda and Jadranka as well for helping organizing the event here. As a way of background, as Richard said, I run Apiran here out of London. My background is more in M&A and fund management. I started my career back in '95 here in London, and I've run Apiran since 2013. Apiran is an investment management firm focusing on real estate, and within real estate specifically on logistics. We also do renewables, and within renewables, solar and wind, and we're looking at getting into data centers later on this year. In terms of overview of our operations today, we run investments across Europe. We have around 600,000 square meters of large big box logistics assets in Europe, leased to the likes of Amazon, Daimler-Benz, BMW, Siemens, etc. Those are mainly large assets, around 100,000 square meters each, leased on to those covenants with long leases, mainly 10 years plus. In terms of how we operate normally in the joint venture structures. We run those structures together with institutional investors, either from Middle East or Asia. We have worked with many of the large institutional investors from Middle East, including sovereigns, out of Abu Dhabi, and also with some of the largest institutional investors from mainly Korea in Asia. When we look at assets, in any country, any country we're looking to enter, we're obviously looking at 4 investment criteria which are very important for us. One of those is obviously the location. How does that relate to the asset class they're investing in, either being logistics or renewables? But in logistics, obviously, we're looking at trade nodes in terms of transportation nodes. When it comes to renewables, we're obviously looking at solar radiation for solar, and then also wind measurements for wind. In terms of technical aspect, is another point that we look at. Obviously, we outsource that very much like Mike gave a very good introduction. We work with all the large service providers when underwriting a transaction. So that is a very important investment criteria. We also look at obviously the returns when we underwrite transactions. We do that internally. We never outsource that. And I think one of the most important criteria that we have is obviously the covenant. When we underwrite the cash flow of any investments that we do, we obviously look at the strength of that cash flow. And I think looking at investment in Serbia for us on the logistics side, it's been rather challenging finding the right tenants to underwrite long leases for that. So we are monitoring the logistics market in Serbia for the time being. We're looking at different locations for logistics, but most likely we're not going to do anything this year. Our primary focus is on renewables, and that is solar and wind. We're looking at solar projects down in southern Serbia because the radiation is much stronger there, solar radiation. And we're looking at wind projects up in the north in Vojvodina, as obvious. I think challenges there is for us is again, how do we underwrite the offtake for those projects? There's been a very limited development in terms of wind and solar in Serbia. I'm not going to talk about that because our focus is solely on wind and solar. If you look at wind, there's been a much stronger development in Serbia. I think the operators today have done really, really well. They started off well, and that's taken many years to develop to where they are today. So that's way ahead. But I think where it's lacking, I think where we have a large opportunity is actually in developing solar projects. Just to make it, in perspective, Serbia has today developed a little bit more than 10 megawatt of solar projects, which is negligent. We're also active in Spain. Spain has today more than 30 gigawatt of solar projects in development. They're probably one of the leaders in the world. So just to put that in perspective, it is really an area that we think that will have a lot of opportunities going forward. Obviously, sustainability is very important for us. That's a big focus. We try to align our focus in terms of all the sustainable development goals, UN sustainable development goals, and we're looking to be a fully green operator by 2030. And that's why we are focusing very much on the renewable sector in Serbia, because as it is today, the country is heavily reliant on coal. And I think there's a great opportunity in terms of renewables going forward. So that's from my side. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Vojkan. I would like to hand over to Stefano Maio from Bechtel, who has now joined us, and I'm delighted to say will explain a little bit about what Bechtel is doing in the region and how they see the opportunities going forward. So thank you, Stefano.
Good morning, Richard. Good morning, everyone. Richard, can you hear me and see me clearly? I'm in my mobile office between the construction site and Belgrade, unfortunately.
Well, I can see and hear you perfectly well, so thank you. I haven't heard
excellent.
From the organisers that they have a problem. So please go.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. My name is Stefano Maio. I've been working for Bechtel for roughly 10 years. Bechtel is a large engineering construction company. I'm going to be a little bit biased today, simply because I'm married to a Serb. I've been living in Serbia for 2 years. My 2 kids keep talking to me in Serbian, and my experience to date has been only positive. I'm going to share with you a little bit what Bechtel does very quickly, what we've done in the region, what we're doing today in Serbia, what we're going to do, or at least what we're trying to do in the future, and then sort of finalize with a couple of key takeaways from our experience of doing business in Serbia. So as I said, Bechtel is an engineering construction company, 35,000 employees. We have 4 business units. I'm in the infrastructure, which looks after roads, bridges, energy, renewables, airports. And we've been in the region for nearly 30 years. We've built more than 700 kilometers of motorways. We've been working with a trusted partner called Enka, successfully delivering motorways in the region. And then about 3 years ago, we really started to focus on building the Morava corridor. About 18 months ago, we were successful. We were awarded this incredibly strategic motorway connecting Corridor 10 with Corridor 11, 112 kilometers. And we're about a year into it. We have some challenges like most new construction companies starting, but we have an excellent relationship both with Corridors of Serbia and the Ministry of Construction, who are the key stakeholders to support us during this extremely challenging and complex project. What are we looking at in the future? We're looking at rail, of course, through our UK experience working on Crossrail and some other major rail projects. We're looking at that. We're looking at the Belgrade Metro. I mentioned renewables. This morning, I spent an hour in Vojvodina and I got the luxury to go up on one of the wind towers and stand 122 meters above and see some of the landscape. So we're definitely looking at wind and solar and motorways and railways. The key aspect is, why did Bechtel focus in Serbia? And I think that's why a lot of the people are on the call today. Stable politics, growing GDP, political security, excellent credit rating, population that's both bilingual, very smart engineers, very skilled and entrepreneurial workforce that we identified as a big plus to help us execute this challenging project. Some of the other aspects that we've noticed related to construction, which may or may not resonate with the audience, is construction permits. Before joining Serbia, I heard that construction permits in the past have been rather difficult. Our experience has been seamless. It does help to have one of the biggest projects in Serbia, but their new SEOPS 360 system is such that most applicants, if they submit the right documentation, they can get the permit in a reasonable time. Bureaucracy. From my name, Stefano, you can imagine I'm Italian. I see there's more bureaucracy in Italy than in Serbia. It's, governments, bureaucrats, decision making is not easy, but that's the same everywhere else in the world. So I have no negative points about that. As far as the risk, we talked about it. Is there corruption? There probably is. We haven't seen it. Again, big project, very close to the ministry, big support from Corridors of Serbia. And, Bechtel, through our ethics and compliance, one of the value adds that we do sell to our customers is, doing everything by the book. So we haven't had any issues with that aspect to date. Last but not least, I need to throw some flowers to our previous panelist, Anna from Karanovic. Karanovic law firm has been helping us for 3 years in Serbia. They're currently helping us in Macedonia as we look to finalize another motorway opportunity. They're helping us in Albania and they're helping me in Bosnia. So a big thank you to a law firm like Karanovic, which has helped us over the last couple of years. As far as my closing notes, I'd like to stay in Serbia for a couple more years. I see a lot more opportunity. I see a lot more infrastructure growth. We see it every day, the award of new contracts for roads, railways. Serbia is growing. The infrastructure is number one on their priority. And as far as investors looking to come to Serbia, it's absolutely fundamental that roads and transport are there to help integrate their business opportunities. Richard, I'll give it back to you there.
Thank you very much, Stefano. A great overview. Now, I thought you have already heard from Petar in the last panel, so I won't spend any more time introducing him, but now he's a panelist rather than a chair. So thank you, Petar.
No, thank you very much, Richard, and thank you, Stefano. It's always good to hear a positive outlook on Serbia and doing business in Serbia. I'm very much in favor of that, and my wife's from Serbia as well, so I can not sympathize with you, but I can appreciate where you're coming from, and I'm very much like that positive view. For those of you who don't know, didn't see the first panel, I'm a lawyer, like Anna, and I know Anna and Karanovic and partners very well. I'm a partner at JMW Law Firm, which is a full service law firm, one of the fastest growing London offices, and one of the few law firms in the UK and in London that's got a dedicated desk for Southeastern Europe. And so we hold the hands of our clients that want to invest into the region, and in particular Serbia. And I'm also the vice chair of the British Serbian Chamber of Commerce. And if it's okay with you, Richard, I've got a few questions that I've just picked up from a real estate perspective, being a partner in the real estate team at JMW, that I just want to kind of throw out there, if that's okay.
Please go ahead.
Anna, I'm going to pick on you first. I was very interested to hear about the land registry and the improvements that have been made in Serbia. And I know that quite a few of investors from the UK, in the UK, the land registry, you get your plan, you get your details from the land registry. If anything's incorrect on that, you can sue the land registry for any kind of information that's incorrect. Is it, I take it it's the same in Serbia, or is it? My question. Sorry to give you this without preparation ahead of time.
Well, depends on what's incorrect. You know, you can always sue. That's your constitutional right, of course. But we don't experience that many mistakes in the land registries. There are some things that are outdated, but they are relatively easy to to correct. What is maybe a challenge is once you sue, the process takes a really long time. Even before the sue, the second instance administrative procedure is probably longer than you would expect, and sometimes even in some obvious cases. So that's probably something that that should be worked on. Yeah.
But you're saying the information that's there, the details that are there, it's all very up to date. And it's
it very rarely happens that something is outdated, but these are some historical things, and coming from the fact that Serbia is actually has been going through different transformations in the last decade. So there are some things that are not up to date, but from my experience, they're relatively easy to correct.
Fantastic. And maybe I'll talk about incentives and ask you a bit more about that later on. That sounds very interesting too.
Sure.
Mike, you've been very successful over the years doing investments in the region, in particular Poland. Based on that success, and I know you touched on it briefly when you did your intro, but what are you kind of focusing? Where do you see that you're going to have most success in Serbia, based on your previous success and based on the pandemic as well?
Yeah. Look, my main focus will be on residential, but not pure residential. So I think, and an area I have spent a lot of time on, I did a huge amount of work on Gdansk shipyard, where we had to work with a lot of historic buildings and master planning of that whole area. Now, it was a fascinating project to work on, because at the time there were 650 developers in Poland, according to the registry, but very few were interested in getting involved with a project like that. It was complicated. It had listings, it had contamination issues, water issues, etc., etc. So, I think my desire of coming into the Belgrade market is to take on interesting, ex-factory projects or brownfield sites, creating, really fun residential communities that aren't just chocolate box, so taking sites, working and repurposing existing buildings and dropping residential buildings in and around that. But, residential buildings on their own for a large community aren't enough. So, it's putting in the neighborhood retail. It's maybe putting in the destination, the food and beverage led retail. It's putting in some office content, and it's making the community work. And I'm lucky, having done work across all of those disciplines, that I can actually, pull them together. And that's a challenge, I'd love to be able to do in the Belgrade market.
No, fantastic, very interesting. Anna, I'm going to go back to you slightly, but kind of to bring Vojkan in as well, because Vojkan was talking about renewables, excuse me, he was talking about solar and wind. Solar in southern Serbia, wind in Vojvodina and northern Serbia. And have you come across any incentives, or is the renewables market something that you work on, Anna? And do you know any specific incentives for that? I suppose is my first question. And if not, Vojkan, just for you to talk a little bit more about your kind of desires and aspirations, particularly for southern Serbia as well, because we had it on the first panel, whereby, you know, investment into Serbia shouldn't just be all about Belgrade. It should be about the regions as well. So maybe a little bit about that, Vojkan. So maybe first, Anna.
Yeah, well, the incentives that I talked about, they're focused actually on production sector and manufacturing factories, obviously. And the aim is to allow investments that will engage a huge workforce, and depending on the amount of the investment, the workforce that will be engaged, obviously locally, and the investment itself, the business program, in the renewables, there are some benefits, obviously, feed-in tariffs, for example, but they work completely differently than these for production sector.
Thank you for that, Anna. And then Vojkan, just maybe a little bit more. My mother's from southern Serbia, and I think your roots are probably from there as well. So I've got an avid interest in seeing the kind of deals that you can do down there, particularly on the solar side. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm originally from Niš, and I know that you one of your parents is from Leskovac, so obviously we're neighbours down there. For us, obviously, the focus down in southern Serbia is very much on solar developments. I think the challenges that we are facing down there is that for solar you need considerable amount of land. For development, and as it is today, I mean, from the project that we have looked at, we have some challenges there that we cannot identify enough large development projects that land. So we have to work with local councils across, you know, southern Serbia to identify land that is mainly state-owned and locally owned by local authorities and so on, as we obviously have challenges. There's not enough large development plots owned, you know, in private hands. So far we have looked at probably 4 or 5 projects across southern Serbia, and I think they're very promising. We have some of those projects are, you know, together with the local authorities. But I think that's been the largest challenge for us is to find large enough flat area for development of solar, and then we will work with local operating partners down there. We're setting up an office in Belgrade, but we'll be working with local operating partners down there on the technical aspects, etc. You know, but I think that's been the largest challenge for us for solar. No, that's great. And I've just got a final question as well for Milan from my side. Milan, you know, every time I speak to investors, they're all talking about, oh, where we're going to finance this from. They may have a particular project or some kind of deal that they want to do over in Serbia or in the Western Balkans. How difficult is it, do you think, in financing a project from London, from the EU, from Switzerland, rather than using local finance?
Thank you. That's a really good question. Very interesting. It's actually difficult to find interesting projects because in Serbia and across the region, local banks are quite well kind of financed or quite liquid. So it is not easy to find a project that you can kind of compete with the local banks. They provide additional services to the companies, and they seem to also focus on top clients in the country, which are also focused of international investors as well. So the place where they can play a role if international investors is I think something that probably, at least this is a Credit Suisse case as well, where there's additional complexity that for whatever reason is not attractive to local banks to solve for. Or sometimes it's a matter of speed, where international banks, and including Credit Suisse and other investors, can compete. But in terms of size, in terms of maturity, in terms of structures, like I understand that, for example, export credit financing is something that local banks can also provide from their local, subsidiary in Serbia, but as well from their headquarters for the international portion. So it is quite competitive, which is good for the sponsors of projects. So there's quite a lot to choose from. And there's also additional interest from maybe less traditional providers who are emerging in the last 5-10 years, financing partners from China. They're quite increasingly active, so there's quite a lot of competition for the projects. Yeah.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. Richard, I'm going to pass back to you for the time being.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm as someone who's relatively new to Belgrade, having been here sort of a little under 2 years. There's clearly a huge amount of opportunity and a lot more interest. I'm still curious as to whether it's a change in appetite or perception about risk, or more about the people are beginning, there's wider recognition of the opportunities in the Western Balkans. And so I thought perhaps I could ask Mike, why the best to start off with? Why now in the Western Balkans? Why is it just it's the next place, or what made you think?
Look, it's an interesting question. I think it's really, if I first came to Belgrade a few years ago, and if I look at Belgrade today, there are cranes everywhere. This wasn't the case, 3-4 years ago. Belgrade felt, certainly before Belgrade waterfront got going, in construction terms, Belgrade felt a very sleepy city. It's come alive. You look around Belgrade now and you see construction everywhere. And I think that is very reassuring to investors, because what we have witnessed in the last 2 years, is huge scale development, and it's being absorbed by the market. And until a market can be shown to absorb that scale of development, nobody believes it. So I think, and of course that's been driven by some pretty solid economic growth, which I believe is going to continue. And I think Belgrade has proven itself not just a capital of a country, but it's building itself as the capital of a region.
Thank you. I wonder whether, Anna, you would also like to comment on something similar from Belgrade looking outwards. Do you think that it's a change in perception or a change in appetite, or, as Mike says, sort of the fact that the people can see that things are changing and therefore want to join in?
Absolutely, perception is changing rapidly, and I have to agree with what Stefano actually said regarding the bureaucracy and the time required to obtain permits. It's really working. It's something that's been working for years now, and those are the things, actually, the facts that change perception. So yeah, definitely I agree with Mike.
And as Stefano has unfortunately had to leave us, Vojkan, do you think that's the same in terms on the infrastructure side and on the energy? Do you think it's about changing perception of risks or recognition of opportunities?
I think it's more recognition of opportunities. I mean, from us, on our side, I mean, we work with large institutional investors, large pension funds, insurance companies, sovereigns, and so on. And I think for them, I think it's a bit early to enter into some of the larger projects. That's why we partner up with larger developers, private equity developers, partners that we have worked with for many years in other jurisdictions, and then we are bringing them to Serbia, saying here's an opportunity. It's very early on. It's not a first mover advantage, but we are very early on in terms of development here, and we are looking to basically develop those opportunities within renewables, within infrastructure. We worked on anything which is kind of ready to build, with permits, etc., to COD, which is completion and development, and then selling that on to institutional investors. But I think within this development phase, from my experience talking to large institutional investors in Asia, Middle East, and so on, they're rather hesitant for the time being. They're looking first, for us to develop those projects, assign contracts, either on logistics or renewables, having those agreements in place, and then for them to be the off-taker there to take that on. But that is just from my personal experience.
And Milan, do you agree with that? That now things are changing, and has Credit Suisse changed its recognition and appetite for risk in the Western Balkans, or is it just that sort of more opportunities are, despite what you were saying about size, approaching you?
I think, we have been active since kind of 2009 post-crisis in Western Balkans, and financed some of the infrastructure projects. Provided loans also to some of the governments as well in the region, or government guaranteed projects. So we always had the appetite. I think now probably there's more projects that are coming up that we can see. But in general, I think the region is becoming better understood and more accepted among international investors. There's some high-profile transactions in the region, so that kind of puts it more on the map.
Thank you. And Petar, is that your experience with the transactions you've been handling recently?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've noticed over the years, there's a dirty word that people used a lot before. And Stefano mentioned it briefly. He said corruption. And it's the perception of that that's changed as well. In every country throughout the world, there is there's a way by which funds are used in a kind of inefficient manner. And that happens everywhere. We had here in London, we had the example of the Garden Bridge. I don't know if you can remember that, Richard and Mike, and Vojkan. That was a project by Boris Johnson when he was mayor of London, and they spent £40 million on architects, on fees, on different parts of it, and then nothing came of it. If that happened in the Western Balkans, there would be a massive inquest as to where's this money gone, who has it gone to, with what are these contracts, etc. But that's just perception, and that has improved remarkably, I think, over the years, and so it should be. I've been working for about 20 years in the market, and not once have I come across anything that sniffs at being mildly corrupt.
But as you say, it's perception, and that needs to, that has improved enormously, and that needs to be continued to work on. Yeah, it's shifting that perception.
But I think if I can just jump in here, Petar, I think it all depends on what phase you're involved in. If you're involved in development, that's one thing. But if you're selling an existing project, then there's not much corruption. So, from my experience, I used to run one of the first institutional real estate funds in Russia back, in 2005, and my fund was backed by the Danish government and large Nordic institutions and so on. And we had a code of conduct and so on. And in terms of corruption, you couldn't be involved in any development, So it all depends on and because the fund was backed by institutional investors, pension funds, and insurance companies, you couldn't be involved in any development because, there were 200 signatures needed for any development, and for each signature, there could be a brown envelope, and so we stayed away from that. So we focused entirely on performing assets and so on. I think for Serbia to attract institutional investors, I think there's great opportunity there, but I think we have to take it in phases.
And just for timing then, Vojkan, maybe, and for Mike as well, I've spoken to a number of investors that have talked about the institutional investment side of things. And these institutional investors may be this cycle at the end, or potentially more the next cycle, that they'll be, the institutional investors would be investing their institutional money into Serbia. Would you agree with that?
Very, very difficult to say. I mean, if I try and draw a parallel with what happened in Central Europe, actually, whilst one or two investors came in before these countries joined the European Union, many, particularly the German open-ended funds, for example, they weren't allowed to go into Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary. And then literally, on the day these countries came in to the European Union, the investment market transformed. And literally over a sort of 2-year period, 3-year period, there was massive yield compression. And that changed the whole dynamics of real estate development, and the profitability. And if you caught that cycle at the right time, you did extremely well. At the moment, we don't have that sort of trigger, in the Western Balkan marketplace, because EU entry is some years off if it occurs. But I think it could be the next cycle. It's a $64,000 question, really. Yeah.
Thank you. Vojkan, I was also interested in sort of the way the drivers for the investing in green energy in Serbia. Do you think it's mostly externally driven, or do you think it's actually driven by a change in perception from the Serbian government in general terms? And is that what's making the difference?
I think change in perception has definitely improved in the last couple of years. They have realized, obviously, that they can't be overly dependent on coal, like they have in the past. And I think they have to sign up to the new accords, and obviously joining EU and so on. There's going to be certain requirements there. And also from a pollution perspective, I think Belgrade is one of the most polluted capitals in Europe. I have to say it, but yeah, it is. I think something has to be done. I think from our side, the perception is very much that we need to work with large institutional infrastructure operating partners as joint venture partners to go in there and take that first phase, development phase, develop those projects, and then be able to attract institutional investors. But I think until it's going to take a couple more years until we see larger, German pension funds and bigger pension funds, coming into Serbia. I think that will take a bit of time. They want to have more certainty. I think getting involved in developments, because of the perception, it has higher risk. So it requires investors to come in and be involved more in development projects. And something like Mike talked about, I was involved as well in the Gdansk shipyard back in 2005. We acquired a large part of that as well in my previous company. And, that was very risky. And it took us some time, to develop that, get permits and reposition that entire site. And obviously today, I haven't been in many years, but it's probably beyond recognition and so on. So I think it will take a couple more years, for us to attract really large institutional investors, large investments in Serbia. It's been perhaps more straightforward in terms of residential development, because that's been absorbed by the domestic market, and that's been very successful. The projects that I've seen in Belgrade today, that's different. But if you're looking for an off-taker, for someone to take those projects, you need to have that, the covenants, you know, the cash flow and so on. On the commercial real estate, that needs to be backed by either a long lease with, you know, a well-known, you know, good credit rating tenant. And if that's not in place, then obviously the institutional investors are going to be cautious. And that's for us, we've identified a number of good logistics sites in Serbia, but we're lacking a little bit of backing of those tenants to come in and sign up those long leases. And, you know, I think the leases today are probably 5 years, and that's a bit on the risky side. We'd like to see them more on 10-year plus and so on. So these are the aspects that we look at, you know, when we assess any investment.
And Anna, is that your perception as well? That actually that things aren't quite, that the time horizon is still a bit on the short side for institutional investors?
Yeah, short. In short, yeah, I agree totally.
And is the green and is the green aspect making a significant difference, but on the infrastructure side as well as the property development side? Are we seeing that sort of there's more appetite, and is green issues and ESG generally having being focused on more in some of the transactions you're handling compared with a few years ago?
Yes, I think so. And I think that there will be definitely more and more of that, especially having in mind the climate change and the whole movement, and obviously the pressure from all sides to care of these things and to implement more and more projects like that. So definitely I expect more and more renewable projects.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of that will be driven by the financing sources and investors too. I mean, there's a substantial move there, you know, to support green initiatives, and I think as operators, you have to respect that, and that's going to become part of your financing cell. You know, you won't. So that's an important aspect of what we're all doing these days.
And do you think that the offer, when it comes from the Serbian government at COP26, will make any dramatic difference, or will it be sort of a confirmation of trend? And Mike, do you think?
I don't know in the end of the day. I mean, if I look at the market, or if I look at certainly, I have to sort of point myself back to Poland here. You know, pretty much all of the developers now, are pretty careful about, their ratings for all of their buildings, and it's becoming an essential. It's not just actually the capital sources; it's the occupier sources too. You know, if you haven't produced a building, that ticks the right boxes in this area, you're not going to get the tenants either. So, but it's tended to be more driven, I think, in the commercial sector. I think it needs to be equally driven in the residential sector. And it's been driven in the commercial sector because the occupiers have demanded it, and the occupiers don't have the same strength in the residential sector. So sometimes the developers have been a bit lazy, but I think they need to get their act together on that side of the equation as well.
Thank you, Mike. Petar, is that your experience too?
Yeah, pretty much. But I'd like to go back to this idea of perception as well, Richard, which is very important. And I think we were discussing the panel, and we were discussing a couple of themes. You mentioned it, Richard, about the vaccination program. I've just been the positivity surrounding the vaccination program over in Serbia has been immense. And I know it, maybe for some people it sounds like it, it's some, politics, propaganda, etc. But it ensures and it comforts people, because the pandemic's going to finish, and then there's going to be investment into the region. Where are you going to invest? Well, we're going to invest in a region and in a place where they've had a successful vaccination program. Where is that? That's Serbia. So I would say that that's a key factor going forward post-pandemic as well.
Yeah.
I would as someone who had my second vaccine last week, I would agree both at a personal level. It's something that I'm quite intrigued by. To what extent in 6 months' time is the fact that sort of you've got a large proportion of the population both on vaccinated? What's that going to have an impact on behavior? Probably relative increased spending, and then many more opportunities opening up and just being a step ahead of at least the other countries in the region, and possibly a significant swathe of Europe of the EU as well.
But I think it's important to note that for the region as well, I don't think you can just do it. You know, Serbia can't just do it by themselves.
No.
And then, you know, and that's why it's very interesting to hear what the president's been saying about him going over to Abu Dhabi and Bahrain or wherever it was, and talking about these factories that are potentially going to be built in Serbia, which are going to produce the Chinese vaccine, and other places which are going to produce the Russian vaccine, which can be distributed throughout the whole of the Western Balkans. So I think it kind of provides a united front for the region, which will be very interesting to see how that develops too.
I think both that aspect, but also the fact that the president, as soon as has actually visited Sarajevo, he's done. They've provided, even when they've already provided some supplies from their own supplies to neighbouring countries, and I won't say it's sort of solving everything, but in some cases it was certainly more surprising than, given sort of the typical Western Balkans approach to near foreign policy. Encouraging.
And Anna will know more than me from just a local perspective, but I think, you know, the economy is supposed to be predicted to increase by 5% maybe this year. I think last year it was one of the fastest growing economies in Europe. Okay, people argue that that's against a backdrop of having no kind of development whatsoever, so they're playing catch up quite a lot. But still, you know, it's a good place to be, and it improves that kind of perception, which is very important for the likes of Milan and Credit Suisse and all these different banks and potential high net worths and groups and consortiums that want to invest into the region.
Milan, is this something that the sort of the post-pandemic aspect, something that's already feeding into your calculations of looking at the region as a whole?
Absolutely. This is something absolutely that's kind of been noticed. And also the rating agencies have seen this as well. In Serbia's case, in some other countries, like for example, Montenegro, they've been downgraded because obviously tourism plays a big role in their GDP. But outside of, for example, a few isolated cases, I think overall it's been, you know, positive. And yes, I think, as we mentioned, perception is reality. So this all helps with you know, improving the perception about the attractiveness of the region. And I think also the big plans that the governments have across the region to take the infrastructure to a next level. I think because there's a lot more opportunities to look at, you know, then people focus. If there's nothing going on, then, you know, people look for opportunities elsewhere. So I think that helps a lot as well.
Thank you, Milan. It seems to me that we're sort of coming to a natural end of our discussion. And although it's 5 minutes early, I would suggest that sort of
shall I just pick up on one point? Actually,
please
we have 5 minutes, and I think we should use it. I mean, I think one of my comments, and you know, if you look at all of this infrastructure investment that is going on in the city, you know, this is going to be a massive catalyst to real estate development. And again, you know, I'll hoik my experience back to Gdansk. You know, when I was You know, for years we were all aware of Gdansk shipyard, and it sat there and it was all a bit smelly, and nobody really paid it too much attention. But you know, then various key infrastructure improvements happened in Gdansk. Gdansk was always cut off from the rest of Poland, but the new airport opened. You know, the railway line went in. You know, an extension to the light railway line was put in. Road improvements were put in. Now, these are all the things that are happening in Belgrade, and you know, then Gdansk took off, and you know, the government up in Gdansk was very clever in the way that it used EU funds. It started developing museums. It was able to shift the whole city. All right. So this combination of major infrastructure investment with strategic, you know, public buildings was a very clever strategy. Now, I see a lot of that going on in Belgrade today, and I can tell you, you know, sure as eggs are eggs, there is going to be some tremendous real estate development opportunity, you know, arising off the back of these infrastructure improvements. And that's got to be extremely good for Belgrade. That's got to be extremely good for the Serbian economy. And I wonder whether some of the other panel members want to comment on that.
In which case, I think what you're saying is that actually perceptions have changed, which is driving the infrastructure investment, which is actually changing the whole environment for property development. And it's almost as if we're going along a pipeline, and encouraged by coming out of the pandemic with Serbia perhaps ahead of some other countries. All of this is actually leading to major opportunities and a change and a positive change in the environment and the economy.
Correct. I mean, you know, if you look at the new road improvements going in within Belgrade, you look at the metro lines going in, you know, these are going to open up new parts of the city for certainly residential development, etc., etc. So, you know, this will cause a transformation in the industry. I have no doubt.
I agree with that, Mike. I mean, it's all about the perception. I mean, if you see that things are happening, if you see cranes and you know, new developments being either commercial, residential, and that's something, you know, that's going to attract new investors. But you know, no investor is going to come in and invest in a sleepy town. You know,
no,
so
correct.
When they see something happening, they feel like they're missing out, and that
you know,
is absolutely
it's
correct.
Belgrade is no longer a sleepy town. I mean,
I don't think it's ever been, but you know.
No, but in real estate development terms.
From a real estate development terms, absolutely, yes. You definitely needed some investment there, and we're all very, very pleased about that. And the perception is, you know, both political and economical and so on, has improved tremendously over the last couple of years, and I think that is really going to help. And we need, you know, institutional investors like yourselves and many others here to come in and take that first development stage and show that it can be done.
Well,
to attract even more investors.
We're not the first. Yeah. I mean, I would say that the pioneers have done have done a great job, and they've actually shown that it can work. You know, we're the next wave coming in, saying, look, this makes sense, and the future's looking good. But it's still going to, as I'm afraid, as we've discussed, it's still going to take some time for the institutions to get there. You know, there's going to have to be more entrepreneurial development before they arrive, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
And I think that's a wonderful note to end on. So let me round up by saying thank you to all our panelists for a most interesting discussion. And I hope, and with a positive outlook. And now, as we have, I would like to hand back to Jagoda and thank her for all her hard work. Thank my colleague Jadranka Davišević-Kitarić, working with her. And we are all delighted that everyone could attend. So thank you. And over to you, Jagoda.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you to all panelists. It was really, really fantastic and very interesting panel. I like when the panel is interactive with a lot of question and answers. And it was really, really fantastic experience to share with us. So thank you very much. I'm sure that my participants are very happy to what they heard today from your experience in this panel.